looking at three species of Andropogoneae, which are in Poaceae, the grass family. I've been looking at their development and trying to link it to their life history patterns and how they'll act in their environment. What I've seen over the course of my study is there are some general trends in morphology that are conserved throughout all three species. For instance, the inflorescence branches, the rames, will often develop lateral branches in a bottom-to-top manner as the rame actually elongates over time. The rame will then terminate with a spikelet as the lateral branches will begin to convert into paired spikelets. These paired spikelets will then differentiate in a top-to-bottom manner, which will then begin to develop into florets. These florets will usually develop as perfect hermaphroditic flowers on the sessile spikelets. However, the pedicellate spikelets will either be vestigial in the case of A.virginicus, or will be staminate in the case of A.gerardii and Schizachyriumscoparium. This appears to be some specialization in life history strategies because A.virginicus also will only have a single anther, which makes perfect sense given that it's a self-pollinating species. Whereas Gerardii and Scoparium likely are using their pedicellate spikelets for outcrossing, which then will form an abscission zone between their pedicel and their pedicellate spikelet to shed it. This actually plays into dispersal mechanics, possibly, for these three species, where Virginicus, given that it doesn't need its pedicellate spikelet, can allow it to become vestigial, while focusing efforts on producing unicellular hairs and awns, which aid in dispersal mechanics, either through orienting the spikelet when it actually reaches the ground, or through actually catching wind and trying to disperse a longer distance. Gerardii and Scoparium, given that they're actually using their pedicellate spikelet, will require it for that given amount of time, but then will try to shed it shortly afterwards so that they can actually try to reduce the mass of their dispersal units in order to try to increase distance away from their parent. So some general trends that we found so far are that, again, lateral merostem length is usually correlated with lateral, or what? Or can I go back a little bit, or?
Yeah. Just go ahead and...
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
So lateral merostem number is usually positively correlated with Rachis length. In Gerardii, however, there is a interesting pattern when you look at the different Rachis branches where there's actually notable disparity between the lengths of each of them. Whereas in Virginicus, they're usually tightly conserved and they'll tend to grow at very similar or identical rates. There's also a basopetalous gradient, which is a top-to-bottom gradient for spikelet size, which, given that the spikelet is developing in a top-to-bottom manner, isn't surprising. The elongation of the glume, which is a bract-like structure underneath the spikelet, also appears to vary between species. In Virginicus, it tends to develop at a very slow rate, whereas in Gerardii and Scoparium, it tends to develop at a relatively similar rate. In the two graphs here that represent different measurements of the pedicellate spikelet, you can see how the pedicellate spikelet and the glume will tend to sputter out later on, as opposed to Scoparium and Gerardii, which again just shows that Virginicus is halting its development of its pedicellate spikelet. You can also see this when comparing it to the pedicel, where you can see the pedicel continuing to develop while the pedicel and the pedicellate spikelets continue to both develop in Gerardii and Scoparium. The awns and unicellular hairs especially help to distinguish Virginicus, given it usually will develop these at a very high rate. Given that there is so much modification, especially in Virginicus, for dispersal, one future direction that we're planning on is looking at dispersal mechanics of these species.